Welcome everyone to this webinar on Learn to Speak STEMish, Translating After-School STEM to Boost Public Support. We're so glad that you could join us. Please feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourselves. And also, we'd love it if you could take the poll that describes your role in your organization so we have a sense for who is on this webinar with us today. We're going to go ahead and get started, but please feel free to go ahead and continue to introduce yourselves as we start moving through the content of the webinar. And before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. It's usually really helpful if you close out other programs running on your computer if things are running slow, especially if you're streaming music or video or things like that. It would be helpful for you to close those down. If you're having any difficulty with audio, if you're listening through your computer, for example, and are having trouble, keep this number handy. We will also be putting this up in the chat box periodically, so even though this slide will go away, you'll still have access to that number. And if you have a question or a comment, use the group chat to interact with presenters and other participants. We have members working with us here today who will be pulling out your questions and comments so that we can make sure to address them at the end. So joining us today, I'm Anita Krishnamurthy. I'm the Vice President for STEM Policy here at the Afterschool Alliance. And joining us today is Jen Nichols, who's a Senior Associate with the Learning Team at the Frameworks Institute. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be hearing from our colleague at Frameworks. So the Afterschool Alliance is leading an effort called the Afterschool STEM Hub. This project is a collaboration among after-school leaders and stakeholders to develop coordinated messaging and communications. We at the Alliance lead this effort, but it includes a lot of youth-serving organizations like 4-H, the Y, Boys and Girls Club, Girls Inc., a couple of smaller providers, professional associations like the National After-School Association, the National Summer Learning Association, the Association of Science Technology Centers, policy folks such as the STEM Education Coalition, and system building folks like the statewide after-school networks, the city folks like Every Hour Counts, and a few researchers. Our goal is really to take a look at the latest research on STEM learning in out-of-school settings, as well as stories and evaluation data from programs, and distill all of that and translate it into talking points and other resources that the field can use to make the most compelling case for after-school STEM. And we've been working with the Frameworks Institute for a couple of years on this effort, and in particular last year to really figure out what kinds of messaging would be most compelling for after-school STEM. The Frameworks Institute, for those of you who don't know them, are a national nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C., and they're recognized experts in conducting the research to understand how words resonate with the public and framing messages accordingly. So Jen Nichols from Frameworks will lead us through their work and recommendations. And our goal is to not just inform you about what they suggest, but to help you really start to use this messaging. And as you all probably learned when you signed up, this is going to be the first part of a two-part webinar series. There's just too much to cover in one session. So rather than cheat everyone of the entire breadth of this work, we're offering it in 2 sessions. We'll get started today and do the second session in a few weeks. Our hope is that this time will also give you an opportunity to try the messages out and come back to that second session with questions and ready for more. So I'm going to turn this over to Jen at this point. And Jen, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Anita, so much for that introduction, and thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I know you're all really busy, so we appreciate your time. As Anita said, this is part 1 of a 2-part series in which we'll be introducing you to Frameworks research on how to build public support for informal STEM learning. And in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll look at what Frameworks research found about the dominant ways that the public thinks about STEM and informal STEM learning. And then we'll talk about a few of the communication strategies that we've developed for talking about these issues more effectively. But first, just to add to what Anita had said about what it is we do, for those of you who haven't yet made Frameworks acquaintance, let me just explain in a nutshell that our mission, we're a nonprofit communications think tank, and our mission is to build the communications capacity of nonprofits who are working on a range of social issues, from education, early childhood development, to criminal justice reform, to climate change. So we work across a big range of social issues, and we're a team of researchers who essentially do applied social science communications research to map the gaps between how experts think about an issue and how the public thinks and talks about that same issue. And then we fill in those gaps with communication strategies that we've developed and tested to make sure they work to help the public actually think more like experts about that particular social issue. And that's what we've done with STEM and informal STEM learning. So let me show you what our research looks like. This is just a quick look at the research that informs all of the tools and strategies we're going to share with you today. So all told, our work on education represents about $2 million of research, and it was conducted over more than 10 years. But a subset of that work is our research on communicating about STEM learning and informal STEM, which itself was a 3-year, multi-method, multi-funder research project. In addition to interviewing experts to see how they think about these issues and what they want to communicate to the public, we also reviewed advocate communications to see what the story is out there right now on STEM, how organizations working on these issues are talking with the public right now, and with policymakers as well. So the results of that research are the tested values and explanatory metaphors that we've developed, and that show a demonstrated ability to shift people's perspectives and understanding on STEM-related issues. And these are the kinds of tools that we're going to be talking about today and in the second webinar on May 3rd. So I mentioned that our research maps how the public thinks and talks about STEM and informal STEM learning. And that involves identifying what we call the public's cultural models on an issue. And maybe the easiest way to think about cultural models is to think of them as cognitive shortcuts that help us process new information as quickly as possible. I like to think of them as kind of a filing system for our brain. So when new information comes in, the cultural models are the mechanism that we use to automatically filter that new information through all of the built-up expectations and previous experiences that help us interpret the world around us. And there's a linguist, Deborah Tannen, who teaches at Georgetown University. She has a wonderful way of talking about that. She calls us veterans of perception. So we've all been practicing perception and interpretation our whole lives with the information that's in front of us constantly, right? We're all inundated with information constantly. So it makes us these veterans of perception that give us expectations about any new information we get. And so our brains are extremely efficient at processing all that information that's constantly coming at us. And the way they process that is through these culture models that filter that information. So their culture models are like default patterns of thinking. They're automatic. And while they help us process information very efficiently, they can also pose real problems for you when you're communicating about a social issue, like talking with the public about STEM-related issues, because those default models can get in the way of people's ability to think more deeply about your message. So it can actually harm the interpretation process. So this little cartoon I find amusing, but it's a good way to think about culture models. Frameworks researchers start any project by mapping the gaps between experts and non-experts' understanding of a social issue, because we know that in order for us to understand what communication strategies will be effective, we first have to pay attention to how people imagine their world, and that imagining or that interpretation happens through the cultural models that they use to make sense of it all. So in this cartoon you can see, as Frameworks has seen in our own research, that people don't know how climate change works. They confuse it with the ozone hole, and then in this cartoon leads them to confusion in their selection of what solutions will work to fix climate change. And that same kind of process is at play in all of the other social issues that we work on, including STEM. So if the public doesn't know what STEM is and what informal STEM learning is, why they matter, how it works, what we can do to make it better, then the public fills in the answers to those questions with what they think they know about the issue, right, with those automatic assumptions or cultural models. And that's going to obstruct their ability to understand and support the kinds of solutions that you, as experts and advocates of STEM learning, recommend. Okay, so understanding what those cultural models are really can help you figure out what you can say differently, how you can tell a different story to help people understand your issues better and help them process the information you're sending them more accurately. I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by the cultural models that are at play in STEM-related issues. Okay, so what you're about to see is a clip from our on-the-street interviews, which is one of the research methods we use to collect data on how people think about social issues. So in this particular kind of research, our researchers go out on the street and offer people a $10 Starbucks card in exchange for going on camera to answer some open-ended questions about an issue, about, and in this case, STEM. So we collect this data and then we transcribe it and we analyze it for patterns of thought across groups, across people, like a diverse sample of the public. And then in addition to that, we also do long-form, one-on-one cultural models interviews. And that's where a researcher sits down for 2 or 3 hours with just one person and asks them all kinds of just open-ended questions, really downloads everything that person knows or thinks about a particular issue. And then we transcribe all of those interviews, those dozens and dozens and dozens of hours of video and recordings that we then analyze to find those dominant ways of thinking about an issue and reveal the defaults that the public uses to think about STEM-related issues. So the clip you're going to see here is an edited version of some of the video we collected that highlights the patterns that we see people using, the cultural models we see them using and thinking about STEM.
We're going to be talking about STEM learning. Are you familiar with that term, a term that you've heard before?
No, I have not heard of that.
I associate with stem cell.
Are you talking about stem cells? I don't know what that is.
How do you think people learn STEM skills?
To learn science.
The sciences.
Science.
Teach what the scientific method is.
Scientific experimentation.
I'm not really sure about technology.
Kids are great with computers.
Computer.
You have your apps.
Mathematics is learned, the beginnings is learned just by being taught.
Rote memorization.
What do you think children or young people need in order to be effective learners?
Obviously, the basics.
I think to be able to read, to write, to do basic computation.
Because it's the basics that you have to function in the world.
So what do you think are some of the things that determine how well students learn those subjects?
Good teachers.
We need passionate teachers.
Teachers who are still passionate about the subject.
Hands-on experience.
A hands-on experience.
Hands-on experience. Science classes I like because it was hands-on.
Where do you think children learn those subjects?
Mainly classroom.
In the class.
In schools.
Classroom.
Basic classroom setting.
What about out-of-school contexts? Like, are those important for learning STEM?
I would think that wouldn't be a very good thing. They're already in school.
I don't agree with that. I think that kids don't have enough time.
Take them out of school and require the same thing. I think it creates a lot of cynicism towards the subject.
They're being overwhelmed with homework.
Yeah.
And they're becoming little computers.
Extending the school day for 1 or 2 hours to do the same things you're doing from 9 to 3, I don't think is going to work.
I think it definitely could be useful.
To me, it's more freedom.
If you're at home or in a different environment, maybe it's easier for you to learn.
They'll get more excited about it if it's involved in a camp, something that's more fun.
Do you think it's important that more kids learn about those subjects?
I don't know if they're the essential or the necessary.
It depends on the child.
I think it depends on the child.
That different people's minds work differently.
I loved science, but, you know, it's not everybody did.
Some people may not be cut out for that.
Everyone is not going to be an engineer or a CPA.
If you want a job in architecture and engineering,
Most people have regular jobs.
But the idea we should turn every school into a technology institute, I don't buy it.
We're way behind a lot of other countries.
The United States is falling behind.
Okay, so you could hear in that video some of the patterns that we found in our research, in those long-form interviews that we also transcribed as we were looking for patterns. So people don't know what STEM is. If you're not interested in STEM, it's some sort of personal flaw. There's really a lot of misguided thinking about who's responsible, that it's about parents getting you interested, that it's about students taking the initiative themselves, it's about whether or not teachers care, so on and so forth. So, so those kinds of patterns are what we mean when we talk about culture models. And at Frameworks, we use a metaphor of the swamp to talk about those culture models, because when you're talking about communicating with the public, it's really easy to imagine that you write this message, you spend a lot of time on it, you put it out there in the public through your website or your blog or a newsletter or a pamphlet, and then you think it hits people's minds and it kind of swims around there in there like a little fish, in a fishbowl that's happy and whole and healthy. But actually, what we find instead is that our brains, because they're already filled with all kinds of things, like all these culture models you saw in that clip, are really more like a swamp. So we've got these really rich cognitive ecosystems that we're sending our message into. And just like a swamp, some of those messages, some of the things in the swamp can be really productive. Some of those models, they can be like pretty orchids, right, that you'd want to see bloom. But some of those models can also be really unhelpful, like alligators that can eat your message. So I saw we have some folks on the webinar from Florida. They may have a deeper connection to that metaphor than some of the rest of us who live a little farther away from alligators than they do. But yeah, so we talk about this metaphor of the swamp, and I'm going to give you a little tour of the cultural models that we found through all of those research methods I've described. First, we see a lot of misunderstanding about what STEM is. When people are able to identify STEM subjects, it's usually science. So they really focus on science, which means that STEM then just becomes science, and math, technology, engineering, those get left off. When people think about math, they reduce it to adding and subtracting, so there's a real basic understanding of what math is or how applicable it is. Technology just equals computers, and technology can often be a distraction in schools, so people think about children with cell phones and playing games and not really paying attention. It's just a distraction. When folks think about engineering, they think of it as a very highly specialized discipline, so the kind of thing that you might not encounter until you're in college and choosing a major. If we talk about how to fix some of the problems with our system and how we train students in STEM subjects and teach them STEM skills, there's a lot of fatalism, the sense that the problem is too overwhelming, it can't be fixed. Nostalgia, back in our day, education was so different, and now everything is a mess. Zero-sum thinking. If we take something from, if we boost one area, we're going to have to take some resources from some other area. So there's that sort of limited pie idea. People don't really understand how learning works or how it happens. So there's this idea that it's just a kind of natural process that kids absorb information. But on the other hand, they do have a grasp of hands-on learning. They understand that hands-on learning is important. They just see it as something that happens outside of school and not necessarily in STEM subjects. When we talk about what it is that children need to do well in school or what kinds of supports and resources they need, often people talk about returning to the basics. So if you talk about increasing STEM learning and access to informal STEM learning, sometimes people default to, we just got to get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's. And there's a lot of talk about teachers who care, so that our biggest problem is teachers who care. We call it a part of the tangible triad at Framework. So when we ask people about any kind of education, STEM or otherwise, what we often hear from people is that who is involved in the education system are teachers, parents, and students. So just those three. There's a very limited image or picture of the whole system. That leaves out informal education. It's just not there. It leaves out all of the administrative work, the policymakers, the whole community, everybody else who has a role and a stake in our educational outcomes. So that really limited view is something that we need to address. Learning locations, there's a definite learning hierarchy in how the public thinks about education. They tend to default to the idea that informal learning is just a supplement. It's a nice to have, not a need to have. And that kids spend too much time in school. You saw that in the video clip too. So children are spending too much time in these formal structures, and they just need some downtime to relax and play. And there's not a clear understanding that play is also learning time as well, that kids are always learning. They don't stop learning when they leave the classroom, and that there are ways to use that time really constructively to help support what their brains are already doing. And then, of course, that informal education is just low stakes. It's, it's free time, and kids can spend it however they want, as opposed to informal education really being part and parcel of what children need to do as well as they can and to gain all the skills that they need to do well later in life. The public can access the idea that context matters, but they tend to default to the idea of this is all about jobs. And so you saw in the video a lot of individuals saying, well, not everybody can be a scientist, or it's just not as important for some people as for others because they may not have a career in the STEM field. Well, we need to help people to understand that what you gain by studying the STEM subjects is much broader than simply job skills, but really it's training students, children, how to think, how to problem solve, how to take information and interpret it and put it together in new ways that can solve problems. And then there's a big global competition frame too. So you heard some people in the video talk about how America is just falling behind and we're never going to catch up because there are these other countries that are gaining ground on us, and we need to compete. And that actually pushes people back into that nostalgia, that sense that we used to be good, we're not good anymore, there's nothing we can do about it, and a lot of fatalism as a result. And then finally, I want to point out there's a lot of talk about differences and explaining away disparities in students' performance in STEM subjects and their STEM skills as a matter of cultural difference, as a matter of personal difference. So some children are more motivated than others to learn STEM subjects. Some are from cultures that just don't value education or just don't value STEM disciplines, that there are types of people, the type who do study STEM and the type who don't. So all of those are ways of explaining disparities that are actually systemic. They're about resources and who has access to these things, and which children are able to gain access to informal STEM learning opportunities so they can really improve their skills and have the opportunity to also become really well-versed in STEM. So I want to play a game with you that we call STEM, we call it Swamp Drop. So we've just gotten a tour of the swamp. Take one last good look at it. And what I'm going to do next is show you a piece of real communication and ask you to think about what you see in this swamp graphic that might be conjured up or called up by some of the language cues, the words and phrases in that communication. So what in that communication might lead people to default to some of these models in the swamp? So I'll do one and I'll model it for you, and then I'll give you a shot to try it in the next example. So here we go. Take just a moment to read this paragraph. Okay, so this is a paragraph that's really about trying to get children into STEM programs, STEM learning earlier. So get them started early, and that's a good message, right? You don't have to wait until you're in high school or college to start learning STEM, and you shouldn't. We need to start students earlier when they're younger. But what I see here is scientific training, so that's going to drive people back to the idea of STEM equals science, right? Yeah, so training right away says school, so people are thinking it's in the classroom, so you're going to drive them back to learning happens in the classroom, why STEM matters and how it affects so many aspects of their lives. So now if kids gain an early appreciation for science and its role in their health and nutrition. So now it's about children just being able to appreciate it. It's not about what children need to have access to STEM, and you're going to drive people towards that part of the swamp where they talk about cultural differences or where they default to types of kids. There are those who are just naturally prepared to appreciate STEM. They have some innate quality that allows them to appreciate STEM, and then there are those who just won't ever do that. Entertainment and convenience of their lives, they're more likely to become curious. So again, it's about drive. It's about very individual responses to STEM. So what's in it for me? There's no sense of STEM is important to us as a society because as we're heading into an increasingly technological world, there are a lot of things that we need to know, problems and challenges that we can't even anticipate today as we're talking, that we're going to need to have the skills to figure out. So instead, this is about STEM as a commodity and education as a commodity. So having those STEM skills may earn you a little more money. It'll be it'll make your life more convenient. That's what STEM is good for, rather than solving world problems, this sort of thing. Okay, so there's a lot in there that can trigger some unhelpful ways of thinking about STEM. I'm going to give you one example, and why don't you take time to read this. And there's a poll up you'll see a poll up in the corner of your screen. What cues in this message might call up some swampy thinking, and what kind of swampy thinking would it call up? So take a moment to read that, and you can select your answers. You can select more than one answer too. Okay, so why don't we take a look at the poll results and see what we have here. Okay, so it looks like, so as I'm looking at what the answers are that are coming in, I see a lot of you have chosen global competition. Almost 75%. Parents are responsible, so it's about parents really playing an important role. So you see parents have to become more interested and knowledgeable, so they're the ones who are responsible for this. STEM equals science. Again, it's really focused all on science being a national priority and science teachers. Almost half of you chose personal drive, so there's that kind of related to, it's not just school teachers. They can't do it all on their own and push kids care about STEM, parents too. So yeah, all of these things are really present in this. This is a message that's intended to really intended to spark people's sense of urgency, but it just drives us back into fatalism, into blaming parents and teachers, into blaming students for not being interested enough. So all of those things don't really help the public who has these default models at the ready to filter your message through them, to see things like what we need really is to support more programs for informal STEM learning. We need to boost the access that children have to programs that are going to help them increase their STEM skills. So the swamp, I like the swamp. I think it's especially important because if you regularly communicate with the public, then you know that storytelling is a really powerful way to share ideas in a sticky and memorable way. But instead of thinking that any story will do, it's important to know what a particular story will do, and that's what the swamp does for us. Okay, knowing what's in the swamp of STEM and informal STEM allows you to predict what the story you tell about STEM will do. So it's a great predictive tool. You can keep it alongside your messages as you're writing your communications and think, wait, if I use this language cue or this word or phrase, I might accidentally be triggering people to think about fatalism or about cultural differences or about parents being responsible in a way that I don't intend, when my real intention is to build support for the programs we know we need to fund to help children build their STEM skills. Okay, so luckily for you, though, we haven't just stopped at the swamp. We've actually done research, lots and lots of research, to develop and test the story elements that have shown a strong ability to move people's understanding of and support for STEM issues. So that's what we're going to move into now. You've seen our descriptive research. Now I want to move into some of our prescriptive research, which is the story that we recommend you tell on STEM. Now, any good story answers its listeners' questions, and this is a narrative arc of the kind of story for social change, for building support for STEM and informal STEM learning that the public needs to hear to really follow along with you as experts to your solutions, to your analysis of what the problem is and how we can fix it. So why does this matter to society? What is this about? Okay, so first level question, what's at stake here? The second level question, how does this work? What's it about? If it isn't working, why not? And then finally, what can we do about it? So those are the questions that our story should fill in, so that the public isn't filling in the answers to those questions with everything that's in that swamp that we've seen. Now, with the time we have left, I'm going to walk you through part of this story today, and then when we come back on May 3rd, we're going to fill in the rest of the story. And what we're filling the story in with, we're filling the answers to those questions in with are reframing tools, and in particular, we're looking at values, metaphors, and examples. And we have other framing tools too, but these are the ones that we're focusing in on these webinars. And we'll start with values. We've got a couple of them. I'll talk about one today, and I'll talk about a couple more in our next webinar. Avoid queuing up global competition. You saw that on the swamp, and you saw that in that swamp drop that we just played. Instead of queuing up a global competition or using that as a message to get people interested in supporting more informal STEM learning, what our research shows you should be advancing instead is the idea of preparing for the future. So future preparation, helping us handle the challenges of the future. And this is a really important piece to hang on to, because global competition is such a big frame. So so because it's something that's so popular and so prevalent in messaging right now on STEM learning, we've tested it. I'm just going to play a clip for you from our what we call peer discourse trials, where we've asked people to look at some frames on performance of American students versus other countries, and take a look at those raw data and interpret for us what's happening there. So this is just a short clip of people talking about why American students are performing poorly relative to other countries in the world in the STEM subjects.
The very first thing I saw was the China on all 3 levels, and the first thing that went in my mind is they have a very strong family unit.
These Asian cultures are much more structured than we are.
Because if you go into a particular community that has a large Oriental population, a lot of times the top students in the schools are Oriental. A lot of it's cultural expectations that flow through.
It's not acceptable. Like this is a way, you follow it, and you're gonna it's like more of like a mechanized thing. Where here in America we're like allowed to be cogs in this machine.
The whole thing about the money, like how could the kids in China be doing so well and they're supposed to be?
The whole cultural scene is very different than what we're used to in other places in terms of studying and work ethic and how they communicate with people.
In a lot of countries, if you're not successful and you don't achieve, you don't eat. In the United States, we take care of everybody. So there
Okay, so you can hear in that conversation what's happening and where in the swamp people are directing their attention, or what kinds of models in the swamp are helping them make sense of this data without more information. First, they're citing a lot of cultural differences. Well, there's no fix for cultural differences. Cultures are the cultures that they are, so there's no solution here. So it wouldn't even enter people's minds when they're thinking with that frame that what we need are more informal STEM learning opportunities to make sure all students have access to the things that they need to actually learn STEM and STEM subjects. There's a lot of nostalgia in there, right? We used to be good, but we're not anymore. And that drives people's sense of fatalism. Well, it drives them back into thinking, well, we're just spiraling down, into the gutter. There's nothing we can do. Our heyday is past. Which leads to a sense of fatalism, that all of this is just one more big entrenched social problem and there's nothing we can do to fix it. At the same time, and this is the interesting about cultural models, is that we can have competing cultural models coexist happily in our swamp. Alligators who don't get along but somehow manage to hang out in the same swamp just the same. There's a lot of nationalism, too, that is often triggered by this global competition frame, where you hear people say, well, we're the best. America is still the greatest country in the world. And when you hear that, what people are thinking as a result is, so there's no need to fix anything. If we're already at the top, there's nothing wrong and there are no solutions necessary because there's no problem. And then finally, what that global competition drive can do is also remind people of their biases and default models of thinking about different groups of people within the U.S. too, which again drives them to explaining away disparities in outcomes by talking about differences within groups or among groups who are all within the U.S. and explaining it away. So, girls perform differently just because they're girls, right? And that's thinking that can actually be channeled out of a global competition frame. So you want to avoid the global competition frame and instead replace it with the idea of preparing for the future. So instead of reminding people that we're in competition with other countries and we may or may not win, instead talk about something that's actually more productive. We need to ensure our future leaders have the skills required to tackle the challenges of tomorrow. Okay, it fosters optimism. It helps make this a matter of public concern. It broadens the lens so people can see the necessity of helping all children to develop STEM skills. Here's an example of communication. On the left-hand side of your screen is a communication about global competition, framed with global competition and individual gain. So those are the frame elements that are shaping that message. And then on the green side of the screen, the right-hand side, we've reframed it with the value of future preparation. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's this is about America's strategy to out-innovate, out-educate, out-build the rest of the world. It's also important to girls and women themselves because they might earn money, more money themselves, so that's a very individual way of thinking about STEM, that it's a commodity, and it's about consumerism. Reframe with future preparation looks a little different. This is about STEM being vital to our country's readiness for the future, and then explains what STEM is. Because people don't know what those letters STEM stands for, one of our recommendations is that you always take the time whenever you can to spell out STEM, what those things mean, science, technology, engineering, and math, so people know what the STEM subjects are. Critical to facing the challenges of the 21st century, we need our future leaders, workforce, and citizens to have the skills required for our information age, for a better economy. So it's very collective. It's about we, not me, and it's really all about how we all benefit now and tomorrow by investing in STEM-related programs. How about a quick quiz? I'll give you just a moment to read these three models of how to apply the future preparation value, and you can enter into your chat box which one you think makes the best use of the future preparation value. Okay, so I see a lot of B's. A+. Yeah, so B, the 21st century challenges we face require new ways of thinking and doing. Supporting children's skills development through informal and formal STEM learning will ensure the next generation is ready to tackle those challenges. Really is, of the three, that's the best option here for applying future prep. The first one, A, when it comes to STEM learning, too many American children are living in the dark ages. That's backing people into nostalgia, fatalism, and so on. If we want our nation to move forward in time, not back, again, that's really a very swampy way of framing future preparation. And then the bottom one, all parents want the best for their children. Enrolling a child in an after-school STEM program can increase their job prospects, set him or her on the path to financial security. That is a really consumerist, parents are responsible way of thinking about STEM learning too. So yes, it also uses an appeal to the future, but it's a very limited vision of the future in which it's about one child, one parent, and individual financial gain, which is it's not a bad end goal. It's just that it doesn't bring everybody to the dance party. If you're not the parent of that child, you have less at stake in making sure that child has what she or he needs to gain strong STEM skills when it's framed in that way. Okay, next recommendation. There's a lot of thinking that STEM it's just about, either you get it or you don't, either you're motivated or you aren't. Kids just pick these things up in school, right? I mean, they'll just naturally decide if they're good at STEM or not. Really avoiding those cues is key because that just depresses people's support for funding the kinds of programs that we know children need to be good at informal STEM learning, to gain the STEM skills that they need. So instead we're recommending that you talk about informal STEM as a really important piece of children's STEM education by talking about immersing them, hands-on learning. So in the swamp we saw that people can really tap into the importance of hands-on learning, but they can't quite pair it up with education and with what happens after school outside of the classroom too. So the metaphor that we have for that is STEM fluency. The story you're telling is that just as people need to be immersed in real-world situations to learn a language, children need to explore STEM in their lives outside of the classroom to really understand and become fluent in these subjects. So that helps people appreciate informal learning sites more and enables people to reason about how learning happens in informal environments, moves people away from those individual or cultural difference explanations for disparities, and also helps them to step away from the idea that if we give more to some, we've got to take it from somewhere else. The pie is limited. We test these metaphors and our values too through both large-scale quantitative online experiments where people are exposed to the metaphor and then they're asked to answer a series of questions that measure their policy preferences, their knowledge, attitudes, beliefs about a particular issue. And those policy measures come from the experts we work with. So people who are advocates and researchers working on STEM education, they give us this is what we want people to understand about this issue, and then we devise those lists of policy measures. We measure people's responses to those policy measures after they've been exposed to one or another of the different candidate metaphors that we're testing, and we measure their results against a baseline group of people who have not been primed at all with either the metaphor or the value that we're testing. So I can answer more questions during our Q&A about our research process if you'd like, and then we do several qualitative analyses too, like the ones I mentioned with our on-the-street interviews and our cultural models interviews. This is just a video from what we call our persistence trials. It shows how people are able to take the STEM fluency model and talk about STEM as learning, just like learning a language. Children need hands-on, immersive, real-world experience to become fluent in the STEM subjects. In persistence trials, it's like a fancy game of telephone. So two researchers come in and they talk to two subjects and teach them the metaphor, and then the researchers leave the room and two more subjects come in and listen, as they're taught by the first pair the metaphor, and then the first pair, they leave the room, and then the second pair teaches the metaphor to a third pair, and so on down the line. So like a game of telephone. And the purpose of that is to see how well people are able to use the metaphor to explain the concepts that experts want people to understand about the social issue that we're working on, in this case STEM and informal STEM learning. And in watching the video, you can really get a sense of how the metaphor helps people think differently. So think back to the clip I showed you of folks on the street talking about STEM, and compare that in your mind to the video we're about to play you now of people using that STEM fluency metaphor to make sense of STEM education and informal STEM learning.
It's a chance for kids to immerse themselves into an environment that they're not used to. Okay, it's like going down to China or whatever and living there and learning their language.
They'll be presented with real-life situations to apply what they're learning, not just something that's structured in the classroom.
More of a freedom to explore compared to a classroom situation.
It's a chance for kids to get to explore. They get to get more involved, get their hands dirty.
That if a child has hands-on experience, they're going to become fluent.
Hands-on interaction in an after-school program that would help stimulate kids into grasping these ideas more so than just learning them in a book. It's more of a true immersion.
Related to learning a language, I think, to make it more just a part of what you do every day.
All of those skills can be learned by doing.
Language, either you learn it, the younger you learn it, the more fluent you probably are, the easier it is for you to understand it and learn it. So maybe the earlier you get the kids engaged.
It's not just going to be structured, like where's the bathroom, all that kind of stuff. It's just going to roll with content.
Okay, so you can hear people really being able to take that up, play with it. Everyone, even if they're not fluent in multiple languages, knows that being immersed in that language is a key part of learning a language. So making that analogy, comparing something unfamiliar like the STEM subjects and how people acquire those skills to something that is really familiar and sticky to Americans like learning a language, helps them to understand more about what children need to gain a strong STEM education. Really quick, here's just an example of how you can take these frames, this is fluency and future prep, and fit them into even a small space like a tweet. The tools are designed to be very malleable. You can adapt them to your communications, whatever those formats and content might be. So to acquire fluency in STEM and meet the challenges of tomorrow, students must practice what they learn in school. Share your examples of STEM immersion. So just very sticky but short and sweet ways of using the metaphor. One more quick quiz, and then we'll get to some questions. Take a moment and use your chat box to indicate which of these choices you think best models the STEM fluency metaphor. Well, I think this crowd really gets framing because you're all choosing C. Andrew has chosen C many, many times. Yes, very emphatically it is C. The first one doesn't work that well because, again, it's a global competition frame. Even though it uses STEM fluency, it harkens back to that crisis thinking that we know isn't very effective. It just shuts people's thinking down and makes them feel overwhelmed, so they go back to thinking, you know what, I can't deal with this. It's too big a problem. I'm just going to go make dinner, take a walk, tend to my family, do the other things that I know I can do something about. B doesn't work either because it's still that really individualized frame. Anyone can learn STEM subjects if they put in the time. Well, then that doesn't open up the frame to the systems and resources that need to be structured in a way that make it possible for all children to have access to STEM learning opportunities. So C is really the best example here. Now, these are the tools I'm giving you today. We'll cover more tomorrow, but so far what we filled in is why this matters, what's at stake. What's at stake is preparing our society for the challenges of the future. So it's the first part of our narrative arc. What's this about and how does it work? Well, learning STEM subjects is like learning a new language. To become fluent, children need immersive hands-on opportunities to practice what they learn. And then if it's not working, why not? Well, we're going to fill in some more explanatory metaphors. One answer to this is that not enough children have enough immersive opportunities. So that's part of the problem. And the fix for that are the programs and policies and initiatives that all of you are advocating for or working in and working on. So we're going to fill in more next time on May 3rd, and these are the things we're going to fill in. Okay, so we're going to talk more about how do you talk about disparities and outcomes and disparities in resources, and we have a value and some metaphors that can help you do that. How do you explain why children need more than just their in-class formal school time? We'll talk about ecosystems, a STEM ecosystem, and explanatory examples to help people understand exactly what it is that an informal STEM experience can give children, how it works, and why it works. And so that's what we have to look forward to next time. Again, we have all of these resources online and encourage you to go to this website, afterschoolstemhub.org. You'll find talking points. There's a quick start guide that shows you what to try to avoid, right? What are the alligators that you're moving away from? What are the language cues you're dropping out of your messages? And instead, what are the things you can substitute that our research shows is much more effective? And then finally, as we move into questions, I'd like to ask you for your feedback. So Dan is going to post into the chat box a survey link. It's a very quick questionnaire, but I take your feedback very seriously, and I'll use it to tailor the webinar on May 3rd to your needs and also apply it to the rest of my teaching and other issue areas. So please, 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 do give me your feedback, and I appreciate it. And thank you again for your time. I think we should just open the door to questions.
So Jen, I think there were a few questions that came up in the chat box, and one of them really referred to this issue about global competition, that the fact is that it is real and that we can't be fatalists, but we can't keep our heads in the sand either. And so how do we actually tackle that? And I think there was one of the commenters, one of the other participants who sort of addressed that, but I think it would be great for folks to hear your take on that issue, because it is a very common frame that everybody uses in communications.
Right. That's an excellent question. And so one thing that I want everyone to understand in using these frames is that the idea is not to put a Pollyanna face on a problem or to pretend like there is no problem. So yes, moving away from a fatalistic frame is really important, because the public has a finite pool of worry. And every time you put out a crisis message or language that invokes the sense of urgency or crisis that you want people to feel, you're actually siphoning off some of that pool of worry until there's nothing left. But we can't actually sustain that kind of emotion for long periods of time, and there's a lot of research that shows that over time people's interest wanes because they feel like the problem is just too big to surmount. So that's why it's really important to emphasize solutions. That doesn't mean don't talk about the problem. It does mean explain the problem in a very reasonable way without trying to incite people to high emotion with a really hyper-emotional appeal or lots of crisis framing and fatalistic numbers that are big and scary and sound impossible to overcome. Instead, just simply, this is the problem, state it simply, and then move to what the solution is. But our research shows very strongly that appealing to global competition as the reason to invest in STEM learning programs just depresses people's support for STEM programs. So it's doing the opposite of what you want it to do, and that's why the future preparation value, which really does work to help people understand the importance of STEM learning and informal STEM programs, is the one we recommend.
Thanks so much, Jen. And there were a couple more comments that I'm going to compress into one for you. And so one was about, and I think you sort of addressed this, but there was a comment about understanding the importance of changing the frame from an individual perspective to a systemic perspective, but perhaps that it's not as compelling a message. And then another comment about how changing the demographics of your focus group would change your responses. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your research methodology, which you didn't have time to go through at the beginning, that really does dig into these issues.
Okay, so first, let me tackle the research one first. In our large scale quantitative analyses or experiments, we're using a nationally representative sample because what we're trying to do is not micro-targeting, but rather to get the biggest swath of the population that we can, to reach them with the cultural models that we all share. They're deeply embedded, they are pervasive, they are fed in all of us by the culture that we swim in every day, the news stories we hear, the media, the literature we read, the films that we watch and TV that we watch, the stories we tell each other. So at the most basic level, we are trying to reach the biggest piece of the population that we can with our messages, and so we do a demographic analysis, a breakdown of these nationally representative samples, and if something only works for women in California, but not for men in New York, then it doesn't get recommended. The things that get recommended are the ones that show real movement across all demographic categories within this representative sample. And then I'm sorry, Anita, the first part of the question was
about really changing the frame to a systemic one from an individual one, and whether that actually really works for people.
Yes, so it does. Our research shows that it does, but let me explain why. Resonance is something that, as a communicator, the truism is you want something that resonates. But what we find is that just because something resonates doesn't mean that it always helps people understand an issue better than another message might. So, for example, Jamie Oliver, the British chef, he ran a whole campaign that was about tooth decay leading to, so the tremendous amount of sugar in processed foods in our diets leading to tooth decay, which put thousands of children in the UK in the hospital every year. So he put that out, famous person, it's a strong message, he puts it out there, and the response is, it resonated. I mean, the hits on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on were immediate and swift, and there are lots and lots and lots of them. But the comments showed that even though the message resonated with people, they didn't understand what he was trying to do. Instead, it came back, all of the comments were about, as a parent, I limit my children's diet. Children need to be taught to brush their teeth. Why don't parents take their kids to the dentist? So it had nothing to do with what he was trying to get them to understand, which is that we have a food system that puts far too many additives into foods, and that makes them unhealthy for children and affects their teeth when they're young. So it missed the mark, even though it resonated. And that consumer message about education misses the mark in the same way. It leaves out people who don't have children because they then don't feel like they have a stake in the issue. And it leaves out anyone whose children are doing okay. Well, my kids are in a good school system, and I have the resources I need to make sure that they have access to STEM. So this isn't my problem, and I don't need to worry about what the solutions are. So that's why we advocate that big picture frame, so that we can show people why this issue matters for all of us, so that we all have a stake in it.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question. And it was, I think there's some curiosity about how you came up with the idea of the swamp, and whether that was before or after you did your research.
That is an excellent question. So the swamp has existed since long before I joined Frameworks. And we talk about the swamp in all of our issue areas, and that's how we have traditionally, as far as I've known for a long time now, talked about this. It's a really sticky way for us to help people quickly grasp the concept of cultural models and how they work and how our minds work and how cognitive psychology works. So I attribute the genesis of the swamp at Frameworks to some researchers early on in Frameworks who came up with that metaphor as a way of helping to explain these difficult concepts in an easy way, just like we're giving you some metaphors so that you can take your complex information and explain it better. And it's worked for us so far. I won't get into it because we're short on time, but when we took the swamp to the UK, we had some interesting responses because the swamp doesn't exist in the UK the way it does here in the U.S. So we switched to bog, which seemed to accomplish the same work. That's a great question, though. Very interesting.
Great. Thank you so much. And we're happy to stay on and answer a few more questions. But I understand if people have other appointments that they need to get to. I think as we've been posting in the chat box, the webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending out the recording slides and all the links that are available in that. And so definitely, you pass this along to your colleagues and your friends, and come back for the second part of this webinar on May 3rd. And what I'll end by saying is that hopefully what you've seen is that many messages that seem really innocuous actually trigger very unhelpful reactions. So I think many of us have a lot of retraining to go through, and I think the swamp is a great way to sort of think about exactly what we're putting out there and how that might land with various stakeholders that we're really trying to reach. And we're very, very excited and proud of the work that we're doing with Frameworks, so definitely check out our afterschoolstemhub.org website. It has a lot of these talking points and the metaphors and values. It also has a very cute little animation that is on that slide that I think if I can go back to it, I will show you. This slide with the little play button where the cursor is currently pointing, that is a video that you can play that actually incorporates a lot of the messages that Frameworks has developed around after-school STEM learning, and it's available as a download. If you page down that particular website a little bit more, it can download it in both standard definition and high definition, and you're very, very welcome to download any of the resources, including the video on this website, and use it in your own communications. So thank you all so very much for attending, and we hope to see you back here on May 3rd. And we'll hang out for a couple more minutes if anyone has more questions, and answer it in the chat box. Thanks for coming. And so, Jen, I'm not sure if the person who asked this question is still available, but there was a question about loving the idea of moving to a more systemic, optimistic messages, and any advice on framing research-based needs statements for institutional funders without getting into the swamp.
I think I need some clarification on what is meant by research-based needs statements.
Yeah, that's not completely clear to me either, and I think the person who asked the question is still there because I saw the name just pop up as typing into the chat box, so hopefully she will clarify. And there was another question while she's typing her clarification about whether it's possible to either receive a copy or link to the street sampling STEM survey, because it seems like a lot of people feel like they could use it themselves in their communications with boards and other folks.
Using the clip. So we do have, they're able to access the clip online. It's on our website in our reports on our website. So in the multimedia report, they would be able to find the clip. We are sensitive to using those research clips in other presentations without our permission because the people in those clips did sign research waivers. So as subjects, we have the institutional review board process that we go through for any of our research, and so while you can watch the clip online on our website, we need to grant permission on a case-by-case basis to use those videos in other presentations because of our of the waivers folks sign.
All right. That's good to know. And Paul, so we can certainly follow up with you on that if you're still around. And the person who asked the question about the research studies did follow up, saying that what she meant was meaning citing research and studies that demonstrate the need to help make a case, I think, for grant funding. So,
oh, I see. So like looking at numbers and statistics on,
I think that's what they mean, that, that most of the data really specifically references global competition and future job markets. So I'll just quickly answer to say that at the Alliance, this is something we're really working very, very hard on as part of the After School STEM Hub project, is how we look at research and surface more current research studies that are available that can help make the case that doesn't immediately jump to the global competition kind of frame, because there is a lot of modern day research talking about the need for learning across sort of settings, across place and time, and why that's compelling. And so we will be making a lot of that available on our website and framed appropriately. So hopefully that will be a resource that will be available to you very shortly. But Jen, I will also have you take a stab at answering that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. We have some guidelines. If you, I'd have to find them. They may not be easy to find on our website, but we talk about framing with numbers and using math to make the case for an argument, and how to use data. I still, even when using those numbers, if you excuse me, have to use those numbers in the context of global competition because that is the data that you have, then still wrap it in future preparation. Make sure that all of your language cues don't push people into that fatalistic swamp of we can't solve this problem, we've been left behind, there's nothing we can do. So I would use a very neutral or warm tone in talking about solutions, emphasizing and just wrapping those numbers very carefully in the value of future preparation, using whatever cues you can so that you're priming your audience before they get to that data set to think differently so that they can receive that message with a little less likelihood of falling back into those swampy pieces, those swampy models. Oh, and I see another question here, too. I'd love to see research that deals with how inquiry-based STEM learning can build creativity and critical thinking skills. So the research we have is all about how to communicate about what STEM does and how STEM does it. We're not doing the research to show what STEM does, but simply how you can translate the results of research that shows what STEM does. We have some metaphors for talking about that in some of our other education work, in addition to STEM learning. So I encourage you to check out our education toolkit as well online, and that could be a good supplement to all of the resources on the afterschoolstemhub.org site.
Yeah, and I will just say that, documenting outcomes and impact and sort of really making sure that any of our policy agendas are very rooted in research is very much a focus of the After School STEM Hub effort. And so we will be looking for research like that, and we will post it on the website. And feel free to follow up with me directly if you'd like to have a conversation about sort of research needs and research statements and data to help make this case, because it's an issue area that I'm certainly very, very interested in and trying to do a fair bit of work on. And I'm at akrishnamurthy at afterschoolalliance.org. Great. I think we're approaching sort of 15 minutes past the hour, and we have to end this very soon. So thank you all so very much again for your interest. It's lovely to see this level of interest, and I hope that you can all start to maybe practice this a little bit in the next few weeks before we meet again, so that you can come to the second part of the webinar with some questions for Jen. And we'd love your feedback as well on whether you tried it and how that worked and where you might have run into some issues and what you could use help with. And so Jen will definitely walk through the rest of her findings, but hopefully we can have a little bit of time at the end of that second webinar to dig into more questions and any trials that you've done with this kind of messaging. We'd love to hear how it's working for you. So stay tuned, check out the After School STEM Hub website, and do register for part 2 of this webinar. Thanks so much. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.